for folks tuning in now that Trump is inaugurated president, thinking, what happened? What's your message for those folks?
Well, what happened was simple: is that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, and I mentioned Joe Biden for a reason, is because Kamala Harris refused to break with Joe Biden's foreign policy stance on Israel. She had stated explicitly that there would be no changes in the U.S.'s security commitment to Israel. But what I think is really significant is that Michigan is home to one of the largest Arab American communities in the United States. I believe there are close to 400,000 Arab Americans here. Half of them live in Wayne County, by the way, which is the largest county in the state of Michigan. It's the most consequential county in the state of Michigan. So simply not winning that county or underperforming in that county, if you're a Democrat, will have a negative impact on your electoral chances. Now, of the 200,000 Arab Americans that live inside of Wayne County, many of them reside in Dearborn, where I happen to be a stone's throw away from. And the feeling was that, Arab Americans and Muslim Americans were incredibly loyal to the Democratic Party, particularly after 9/11 and the ushering in of neoconservatism and the war on terror, which, by the way, Arabs and Muslims used to vote astoundingly for Republicans, but they broke with that after 9/11. So despite the loyalty that we had shown to the Democratic Party, they decided to basically spit in our face, act as if we were invisible, and they decided to choose Benjamin Netanyahu, a convicted war criminal, over their own Arab American constituents. Kamala Harris refused to come to Dearborn. When she was heckled by other Arab Americans, she essentially told them to shut up or else Donald Trump will win, basically indicating she did not care for the suffering that was happening in Gaza. And I happen to know those people, and I happen to interview those people that she had gotten in a confrontation with here at Detroit Metropolitan Airport, which I believe occurred on August 5th. But here's where the biggest thing happened. Donald Trump saw an opening. Trump saw Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party was willing to sidestep the Arab American vote, Arab American sentiments, and essentially downplay the United States' role in facilitating the genocide in Gaza. That's not to say that Donald Trump has a perfect policy prescription for this, but he did a very politically savvy thing. He hired Mossad Bolos to be one of his Mideast aides. He brought him to Dearborn, and based off sources I know close to Trump administration and community leaders that spoke with the Trump administration, Mossad Bolos and others, he had seemed to actually take a keener interest in what was happening because that he had pledged to, quote unquote, stop the war. He pledged to promote peace in the Middle East. I think a lot of people in this community knew that was a very broad and vague plan, but it was better than what they were hearing from the people who were supposed to support them. And as the election continued, or should I say, as the debates continued, we saw no shift from the Democratic Party and Kamala Harris. And I think when it came down to it, Arab Americans thought to themselves one thing: okay, Democrats, if elected, aren't going to do anything on Gaza. That's just the truth. But Donald Trump, who, yes, we know implemented the Muslim ban, who we know said horrific things about Palestinians on the election trail, he has political capital, right? After this, he can't run for president. But Kamala Harris has to, meaning that if Trump wants to get hard on Israel, which still too early to say, but that seems to, and there are indications that this is happening, at least based upon conversations that are happening between the Trump administration and Netanyahu. He can get tough with Netanyahu. He can get tough with Israel. There's not going to be any political consequences. He has nothing to lose. Juxtaposed to where if you elect Kamala Harris, she is bound by those same political constraints of loyalty to Israel and the political consequences that come with possibly breaking with the quote-unquote ironclad commitments between Israel and the United States. So, I think in sum, the Arab American community here in Michigan took a gamble. As we speak now, that gamble looks like it could have paid off and saved thousands upon thousands of countless lives in Gaza. But the switch is real now. I don't ever think you're going to see Arab Americans vote for Democrats the way you have in years past. I think we're back to voting Republican.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the thing is, I think it was a smarter bet than I think Democrat loyalists could have promised. Like, the only signs that Kamala Harris, first of all, banning any Palestinian speakers of the DNC, like,
Yes.
the overt signals were clear. The only hope people had was to read like personnel decisions, but it's very, I find it very hard to believe that even like, say, Iran deal type guys who she could have pulled in would have been as direct to Israel as what's the guy's name, Witkoff,
Steve Witkoff,
so early on. And you know what I sort of think, and let's talk about like the way Arab Americans are buying the Trump sort of promises. Like, I don't think it's naive in any sense of imagination, and I think, you know, as we get to maybe forecasting what's going to happen, I think he'll be punished too in case the genocide breaks out again and he's unable to do anything about it. But it was clear that to me that I don't think any promises could have been made for Harris. And Trump, the strongman thing of like being like, at least don't embarrass me on the day that I have parties planned. And the truth is, like, the images we're seeing, you were not going to see those with Biden and Harris in charge.
No, and I think it's. I really want to make an important point here. You talked about personnel decisions. So I have had conversations with journalists who swear up and down to me, and these are members of the liberal media and otherwise, who said that, hey, listen, Arab Americans need to vote for Kamala Harris because she wants to hire Phil Gordon be her national security advisor, who I think is a decent individual. He has a much different foreign policy perspective than others. She wants to assign Elian Goldenberg to her Middle East envoy, who was a staunch opponent to many of Trump's policies, and she wants to bring in Hadi Amar, who's in the State Department, who's a Palestinian American. Here's the problem. When you relegate these pragmatic voices into the shadows, don't give them any chance to speak with Arab Americans, and regurgitate the same quote of "we have ironclad commitments with Israel," then nobody's going to be able to make the electoral difference between Trump and Kamala Harris. You also mentioned Iran. If you listen to those debates, Kamala Harris sounded no different than the Republican right on Iran. She was saying they're an enemy, they're one of the greatest adversaries to the U.S. She even was pounding her chest about NATO, talking about defending Ukraine. And these are things that were just beyond Arab Americans, that were just really off-putting. And I think that's what forced not just Arab Americans, but independents to say, hold on a minute. If there's one person who has the personality and the wherewithal to just say, stop it, and break from the status quo, it's Donald Trump. Will it happen? I mean, he's not even president, and we've already started to see things wind down significantly.
Yep, and let's talk, before we get to like forecasting Trump's administration, let's talk about the current violence in the West Bank particularly.
Oh, absolutely. Ever since the genocide in Gaza began, the Israeli settlement empire and Israeli settlers have used the cover of war in Gaza to accelerate settlements at a record pace, but also partake in historic amounts of settler violence against Palestinians. The Office for Coordinating of Humanitarian Affairs has said that they recorded the most instances of settler violence in their nearly 20 years of documenting such crimes. 1,400 instances of settler violence, which ranged from killings, robberies, the razing and destruction of farmland and personal property, the firebombing of homes and vehicles. And as a result of these heinous actions by the settlers, which is undoubtedly backed by the Israeli government, 560 Palestinians are permanently displaced within the occupied West Bank. Furthermore, we've also seen the largest expropriation of Palestinian land since the Oslo Accords. Hundreds of acres of Palestinian land was expropriated by the Israeli government, and that now belongs to the state. And this is essentially land theft and in broad daylight. I also think it's important to note that the U.S. not just has a significant culpability in what's happening in Gaza, there's a significant culpability in what's happening in the occupied West Bank. The United States sends M4 and M16 assault rifles to Israeli military units, who then use those said U.S.-made rifles to indiscriminately target and kill Palestinian civilians in the occupied West Bank. But furthermore, we are starting to see U.S. weapons end up in the hands of Israeli settlers who are acting as a conduit and extension of the Israeli army to partake in these heinous acts of settler violence. So what we are now seeing is not only are there significant consequences for the submersion of the rule of law as it pertains to U.S. law in Gaza, but such subversion of law is having dire consequences for Palestinians even in the occupied West Bank, in which there is no Hamas. So there is no excuse for Israel to be conducting these heinous crimes.
The settler part of the of Netanyahu's coalition, I saw Biden quote the other day saying, he's got a tough coalition to deal with. And it's like the idea that these guys were running against fighting fascism as they were arming just a very overt type of fascism. It's so, I mean, the lesson for history is if history is able to be, is a discipline exists, is so clear.
Absolutely, and I just think it's that cognitive dissonance that the United States wants to portray itself as the defenders of democracy, this bastion of liberalism and civilization. But while they're doing that, they're actively funding some of the worst crimes we are seeing of the 21st century of what's happening in Gaza. It's very hard for the world to take us seriously when we hear the United States pontificate about human rights and rule of law, democracy, and liberalism, while they stand idly by and aid and abet the horrific crimes that are occurring to Palestinians.